Star Wars comics have been around for decades, but how do you know which ones are actually amazing? Between canon and legends, there are thousands of issues and hundreds of series to choose from, and it's never been easier to get your hands on them, so let's see which books are really worth it. I'm Eric, welcome to Utini, and today we're going over the best Star Wars comics of all time. You may be surprised to know that Star Wars comics have been around longer than, well, Star Wars. Roy Thomas and Howard Chaykin's Star Wars #1 retold the beginning of Lucas's screenplay of A New Hope, but it was released on April 12th, 1977, over a month before the film hit theaters. So saying that comics have been a part of Star Wars since the beginning is technically an understatement. But to celebrate that legacy, we're gonna count down the best Star Wars comics we've read since that fateful day. However, before we do, we're gonna go over a few key terms as well as the best ways to acquire the comics we'll be talking about. If you've already been reading Star Wars comics for a while, feel free to jump to the timestamp on screen to get right into the list. But for the rest of us, the first batch of terms we need to go over are comic, trade paperback, graphic novel, and omnibus. These are the four most common formats of comic story, and they're often used in somewhat incorrect and ever-changing manners. So let's get it straight before we dive into the books. A comic is simply the term for a serialized story with writing and art. They will usually be a single issue within a larger story, and more often than not, they'll have an issue number on the cover like you see here. A trade paperback will customarily combine 4 to 7 individual comic issues into one bound volume, which makes it easier to read in one go. Usually, each trade will contain one full story arc, and if you're ever confused about what issues are contained within a trade, they'll usually just tell you right on the back, just like this. Now, a graphic novel is often used interchangeably with trade paperbacks, which is a bit confusing. But officially, a graphic novel usually signifies a longer story presented as a single volume. Because this happens so rarely in Star Wars, graphic novels are often used as umbrella terms for all of comics at places like Barnes & Noble and Amazon, but there is technically a slight difference underneath it all. And finally, we have the omnibus. An omnibus is a massive collection of comic issues put together in a bound book that can contain up to 50 individual issues. Sometimes these are sold to combine the entire series, and sometimes they combine a few different series into one. They definitely carry a price tag to match, but they're a fantastic collector's item for completionists. Now, in addition to the comic publishing terms, we'll also be throwing in two key Star Wars publishing terms today: canon and legends. These represent the two different Star Wars timelines, and we're including comics from both in our list. Now, if you want a more thorough explanation of the difference between the two, check out our video from a few weeks back. But for our purposes today, canon comics apply to stories taking place in the current timeline and were generally published after 2014. Legends comics apply to stories that were published before the Disney acquisition and take place in their own complete timeline, generally being published before 2014. All right, so now that we've got the terms out of the way, there's one more quick thing to cover before we start with number 10. How do you read the comics we'll be talking about? Well, if you don't mind reading digitally, the easiest way to consume all the Star Wars comics you can dream of is Marvel Unlimited, a monthly subscription service that supplies you with individual comics on a few-month delay. So if you don't mind being a few months behind current releases, you'll have access to every Star Wars comic in history with the touch of a button. But if you'd like to have these stories on your shelf, you can't go wrong with trade paperbacks, or in some cases, even omnibuses that collect them in the most efficient and beautiful format available. Amazon links to all of these will be included in the description down below, so you can even help out the channel in the process. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's sit back, relax, and jump into our first comic on the list, a throwback to an earlier age, a much earlier age. Tales of the Jedi was a Legends anthology series from writers Tom Veitch and Kevin J. Anderson and a host of different artists published between 1993 and 1998. In total, the series covered 8 different story arcs throughout its run, and most importantly, these were the oldest stories in Star Wars to that point, with the oldest one taking place 5,000 years before Episode 4. Now, 6 of the 8 tales took place around the Great Sith War, and even uttering those words is unbelievably cool. With this backdrop, you got battles on epic scales and some all-time amazing characters like Exar Kun, as well as some of the most famous dark side lore in history, like the fabled planet Korriban. And there's something special about this period of time because it hasn't really been touched in canon yet. Dawn of the Jedi and Knights of the Old Republic ventured here later when they were released in the later 2000s, but Tales of the Jedi still carries that level of wonder and mystique that comes with ancient Star Wars storytelling. And there's nothing really like that sense of discovery you get from seeing the building pieces of the galaxy as they're put into place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. On the other hand, even though it can be fun to look deep into the past, sometimes you need to reinvent yourself completely, and that's exactly what happened with our next series, simply titled Star Wars. The 2015 reintroduction to canon from writer Jason Aaron, artist John Cassaday, and a host of other creators in the subsequent years. Now, even though Star Wars began at Marvel back in 1977, the license switched to Dark Horse Comics in 1991, and that's who published most of the Legends tales that defined the franchise for the next 2 decades. But after the Disney acquisition, the rights reverted back to Marvel, and they announced this move with a bang by releasing this landmark series. Star Wars 2015 follows Han, Luke, and Leia in the days immediately following A New Hope before the darker days of The Empire Strikes Back, and it's one of the best examples of pure Star Wars adventure. Because even though there are a number of fantastic original characters in the new canon, there's something undeniably joyful about the return of the original Golden Trio. As the series goes on, readers learn more about the burgeoning rebellion and meet some characters that go on to play larger parts in the comics world for years to come. We see Luke continue to evolve in his understanding of the Force. We see Han and Leia's electric chemistry play out right in front of us, and hey, Han, Leia, and Chewie even pick up lightsabers at one point. I told you it was fun. A shining example of the joy and spark that inspired the original trilogy, Star Wars 2015 remains one of the best Star Wars comics you can pick up, as well as being a perfect jumping on point for new readers. The series ended up lasting 75 issues until it ended in 2020, only to be relaunched as a new series, aptly named Star Wars, with the #1 issue that began after the events of Empire. I warned you this stuff gets confusing. But let's say you're not quite in the mood for 5 years of comics. That's perfectly all right. Sometimes you just want to sit down with a trade, read a complete story, and move on with your day. Well, you're in luck, because Star Wars has plenty of those, and one of the best is one you may have missed when it came out back in 2015. It's Star Wars Lando from Charles Soule and Alex Maleev. Part of the big Marvel relaunch of 2015, Lando encompassed 5 issues of adventure with Lando and Lobot. And while it may not necessarily appear so at first glance, this series still represents one of the best, cleanest heist stories we have in Star Wars comics, while also being the debut of one of the biggest stars in the game. That's right. Not only did Lando bring the character back into canon comics, it was also the first Star Wars comic that Charles Soule ever wrote. And it's very easy to see how this series launched him on a trajectory to becoming one of the most prolific comic writers we have today. Because we all know that Lando is cool, and this series exemplifies that to the millionth degree. But what's cooler than simply being cool? How about launching a heist to steal something from Emperor Palpatine's private yacht? Seriously, the pitch alone is almost worth the price of admission. Lando easily earns its spot on this list by being such a fun, digestible story that also fleshes out a fan-favorite character and setting Soule on the path to stardom. Another canon limited series joins the list next with Greg Rucka and Marco Cicchetto's Shattered Empire. This 4-issue mini from 2015 picks up right after the Battle of Endor, and while the main cast does make an appearance, the real stars of the story are Shara Bey and Poe Dameron, the future parents of a particularly great pilot. The story is incredibly fast-paced as the rebels deal with the immediate fallout of the second Death Star's destruction. Shara and Kes take to the air and ground to lead various assaults on the remaining Imperials, and the new political structure of the galaxy begins to take shape before their very eyes. Aside from Bey and Dameron, however, the true star of this book is Marco Cicchetto, who introduced himself to Star Wars with some of the most impressive art in all of Star Wars comics. His use of dynamic action alongside tenor intimacy immediately cemented him as a force to be reckoned with, as he took his talents to future books like Obi-Wan and Anakin, Captain Phasma, and the Screaming Citadel. By combining the thrill of victory with the unease of the changing galactic regime, Shattered Empire pulls no punches and delivers a truly phenomenal Star Wars story that can all fit in the confines of a single trade. But you know what? It's been a while since we had a Legends title, so let's fix that with one of the most iconic ones we've ever had. A series that has been a massive hit on our Legends Look Back podcast, so much so that one of the hosts even has a tattoo inspired by it. It's time to talk Dark Empire by Tom Veitch and Cam Kennedy. Back in 1991, Star Wars Legends was entering its golden age thanks to Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire. But in December of that year, Dark Empire made a mark of its own by introducing a psychedelic story that dealt with a secret that only the Sith knew: cloning. Dark Empire compiles 6 total issues that deals with the remains of the Empire after Return of the Jedi. But a quick reminder, this is the Legends timeline, so we won't be seeing Shara Bey or Poe Dameron anywhere here. And the story is definitely one of the weirder mainstream titles in Star Wars, but that's not even necessarily what makes it stand out. It's the art style. Cam Kennedy's art in Dark Empire is so beautifully unique, and as we said, it borders on psychedelic. The shapes and colors are more representative than literal, and the result is unlike anything that Star Wars produced before or since. But somehow, it fits the structure of the narrative perfectly, and by the time you finish, you can't imagine another artist properly portraying this crazy story. And for fans of Legends Look Back, it's probably worth mentioning that this is the birthplace of the one, the only, Naked Palpatine. Maybe that's a pro, maybe that's a con, but it's definitely memorable. As we enter the top half of our list, we're heading back to canon to tackle a slightly longer series that took us all by surprise. A series that could have been a one-trick pony, but instead turned into a fascinating character study that expanded the mythology of the sequel trilogy in ways we never expected. Charles Soule, Phil Noto, and Angel Unzueta's Poe Dameron. This book lasted 31 issues from 2016 to 2018 and chronicles the adventures of Poe Dameron and Black Squadron and their time together before The Force Awakens. While Poe's introduction in the movie is fantastic in its own right, this series does a wonderful job of telling us just exactly how he got there. And even though Poe is the titular force in the series, some of his compatriots manage to steal the spotlight quite often. Snap Wexley, Jess Pava, Carrie Coon, and Lula Lampard all take turns proving themselves throughout the run. And by series end, it's no wonder that they're the chosen few that Poe would trust on his wing in the assault on Starkiller Base. Because while Soule gives the series the feel of a classic fighter pilot drama, Poe Dameron examines the inner workings of each character even deeper. Those moments captured majestically thanks to Noto, largely known for his covers outside the series, and Unzueta, who gives the series a boost of kinetic flair throughout. If you somehow escape the sequel trilogy not loving Poe Dameron, this series will fix that in quick order, while also giving you a much deeper sense of the era as a whole. A wonderful pairing with Shattered Empire if you'd like a broader look at the Dameron family tree. And it's here that we must discuss probably the most popular character created on the page of Star Wars canon comics. In 2016, Star Wars comics were back in a big way, but there was something missing. Something wholly original, something readers had never seen before. And that's when we got the rogue archaeologist, Dr. Aphra. Dr. Aphra's first titular series from Kieran Gillen, Cy Spurrier, Kev Walker, and more ran for 40 issues up until 2019 and cemented her as the most successful original comic character in Star Wars canon. Originally introduced in Gillen's Darth Vader run the previous year, Aphra is essentially a moral inverse of Indiana Jones, an archaeologist always looking to make a score and potentially backstabbing whoever she needs to on her way. And yet, she somehow has an astonishing supporting cast. Aside from Aphra, this wildly charismatic series also includes fan favorites like Aphra's ex-girlfriend, who is also kind of Han's ex-wife, Sana Starros, the future star of the Book of Boba Fett, Kersantin, and the deliciously terrifying murderbot duo of 000 and BT-1. And although Aphra never misses the opportunity to take center stage, the strength of the entire ensemble is really what makes this book shine. This book was also a landmark in LGBTQ+ representation for Star Wars, as it marked the first Star Wars comic headlined by a queer character. It was nominated at the GLAAD Awards for Outstanding Comic Book in 2019, and won the following year, with its relaunch doing the same in 2024 when it was penned by Alyssa Wong. Now, Aphra may be obsessed with the relics of the past, but our next entry takes us there directly with the High Republic Adventures from Daniel Jose Older and Harvey Tolibao. The first iteration of this canon series spanned 13 issues between 2021 and 2022 and took place in Phase 1 of the High Republic. For more info about the initiative, be sure to check out our beginner's guide down below. The High Republic Adventures is easily one of the most pleasant surprises in the history of Star Wars comics. An all-ages comic originally published by IDW, this book follows a gang of Jedi Padawans and other younglings in the High Republic era as they navigate the growing Nihil threat in the galaxy. That's the basic idea, but it opens up to so much more. The series is about action, it's about love, it's about loss, it's about humor. It is so multifaceted in ways that should make it way too overly complicated for every audience, yet somehow it remains cohesive and enticing throughout. Older writes every character with depth and respect in ways you don't often see when it comes to younglings, and Tolibao's art is quite simply gorgeous. The detail in every panel is exquisite, and whether it's the destroyed mountain vista or the inside of the Jedi Temple, every scene is built with specificity and pure artistic brilliance. It's unlike anything else in the Star Wars comic galaxy. What could have been just a silly kids series without real stakes and emotions instead turns out to be an earnestly spectacular Star Wars story filled with characters deserving of their place in the pantheon of High Republic heroes like Avar Kriss and Elzar Mann. Now, funny we should mention Avar Kriss because she just so happens to be a main character in our penultimate addition to this list. The 2021 Utini Comic of the Year from Kevin Scott and Ario Anandito, it's The High Republic. The first iteration of this series ran for 15 issues and told the definitive comic story of Phase 1 of the High Republic. Similar to our best canon novel of all time, Light of the Jedi, link in the description for that full video, the High Republic series embraces the pure magic of what makes the High Republic era great, while creating an entire visual language for the era right alongside the High Republic adventures. Scott's characters in this series, like Keeve Trennis and her master Skier, are some of the best examples of Jedi you can imagine. They're idealistic yet flawed, they rise and they falter, and they do it all amidst the beautiful artwork of Anandito. When I think of what the High Republic looks like as a whole, I think about the artwork in this series. It encapsulates just as much majesty as any novel and puts Ario right up on that artistic pedestal amongst the greatest artists we have in our fandom. This series takes you through the biggest moments in Phase 1 of the High Republic and has an absolutely devastating ending that leads you into future tales. And for trade readers, the final volume even includes the Eye of the Storm miniseries from Charles Soule, so you can learn a little bit more about the fearsome Marchion Ro. Now, while Marchion Ro may be fearsome, he's not the fiercest character on this list. That goes to a very special character in our number 1 spot. A villain consumed by fury and rage, one who has experienced untold depths of tragedy and despair. And you know what? It makes for an incredible story. It's Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, by Charles Soule and Giuseppe Camicoli. In 2017, Charles Soule wrote the definitive canon story of Darth Vader, period. This 25-issue series takes place right after the events of Revenge of the Sith, and as such, features the transition across that fateful line from Anakin to Vader, and the results are as brutal as you might think. We witness a newly emerged Vader discovering the horrors of the life he must now lead. We see him come to terms with the realities of what he's done to Padme, as well as the birth of the Inquisitors, and all the while, we're accompanied by artwork that can only be defined as spellbinding. Within this series, Soule does more for the mythology of Vader and the workings of the dark side than any other comic in the Star Wars canon. It's the series that confirmed his ascension to the ranks of writing mastery, and it's a series that every fan can revisit time and time again to see how it continues to inspire Star Wars to this day. And there we have it, the best Star Wars comics of all time. Now, naturally, we couldn't fit everything we wanted on this list, so here's a quick rapid fire of titles that just barely missed the cut, but are still well worth your time. Star Wars Legacy from John Ostrander and Jan Drosema is a Legends series that started in 2006 and took 50 issues telling the story of Cade Skywalker's attempt to take down Darth Krayt, 130 years after the fall of the Empire. Think bounty hunters, smugglers, pirates, Sith, and Luke as a Force ghost. The High Republic Edge of Balance is a series of canon manga that tell a story spread along multiple phases of the initiative, but this slot goes specifically to Precedent from Daniel Jose Older and Tomoyo Ogata. Set in Phase 2, Precedent tells the story of Wookiee Jedi Arkoff as he travels to the planet Dalna to fight a Force cult. While there, he discovers that his friend has fallen to a terrifying dark-side force, and, well, it sets up some pretty massive events for the rest of the initiative inside a medium Star Wars will hopefully use more and more. And finally, we have KOTOR, the Knights of the Old Republic series by John Jackson Miller and a whole host of artists. Another 50-issue series, this also began in 2006 and follows Zane Carrick, a young Padawan in training who is horrifyingly betrayed on his way to knighthood. Set 8 years before the game of the same title, this series has murder, betrayal, outlaws, and a shiny omnibus edition. Just like Star Wars movies, books, and shows, comics are an intensely personal medium, and different writers and artists will speak to different people. Some of these books may entice you, and some of them may not be your favorites, but they all hit the mark for us. Leave a comment down below with some of your favorite Star Wars comics, and while you're down there, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe if you want to keep celebrating Star Wars with the rest of us. And don't forget to check out our Cosmic Force podcast for all the comic talk you can imagine. Until next time, may the Force be with you.